The idea of getting lost in the middle of nowhere is scary enough on its own. The thought of being stranded, helpless, cut off from the rest of the world, it's something that plays on all our worst fears, but it gets really scary when it happens to you personally. See, horror stories are one thing when they're just words on a screen, something you read or listen to late at night for a little thrill. But when it happens to you or someone you love, when you feel it in your bones, when you remember the way your chest tightened, the way your legs ached, the way your mind fought to stay calm, that's different. Let me start with two personal stories. These aren't things I pulled from some Reddit thread or old newspaper article. The first happened to my sister and the second to me. And after that, I'll share another one I found. The kind of story that make you wonder just how many people disappear into the unknown, never to be heard from again. So sit back, listen close, and maybe, just maybe, think twice the next time you find yourself somewhere you shouldn't be. And thanks for watching. Some stories change you, not just because of what happened, but because of how close you came to never telling them at all. This first one isn't mine, but my sister's. She's a doctor now, someone who has seen life and death more times than she can count. But when she talks about that day, her voice always drops to a whisper, like saying it out loud makes it real again. Zambales is one of those places where the ocean looks inviting until it isn't. A quiet coastal town most of the year, but during surf season, the waves can reach 8 feet high, strong enough to throw even experienced surfers around like ragdolls. But this wasn't surf season. The water was flat, the sky was clear, and the sea looked calm. Predictable. You wouldn't think twice about wading in. Take note, this was also back when Nokia was still king. No selfies before swimming, no GPS tracking, no mobile data to check the tides. If you wanted to reach someone, you texted and hoped they still had load. That afternoon, my sister and 4 of her friends stood on the beach, looking at the island just off the coast. It didn't seem far. A short swim, maybe 30 minutes, maybe even less. They didn't rent a boat. Instead, they grabbed a huge black truck tire inflatable, something big enough to hold on to and rest when needed. They thought that was enough. They thought it looked easy. It was supposed to be a day off after a long medical mission in a small town by the sea. A week of treating fevers, stitching wounds, and working under the heat left everyone drained, but satisfied. The next morning, they'd be heading back to Manila. Don't play too far, the old folks would say. The waves here, they change. The sea will be calm one moment, then take you the next. People said it the way they tell kids not to whistle at night. A warning, but not something you actually believe. And just like that, 5 of them waded into the water and started swimming. The waves were small, the sun hot on their backs, the salt drying on their skin. They floated, kicked lazily, letting the gentle current do half the work. They kept one arm around the inflatable, the other paddling, taking turns to rest, switching off when someone got tired. The water gradually turned colder. Not enough to raise alarm, just a slight chill, a change in the currents. Then someone noticed. They weren't moving forward. They kicked harder, but the island stayed where it was. That's when they turned around, and the shore behind them had pulled away. Fast. The fun was over. The waves started rising, just a little at first. The kind of gentle pull you barely notice, until you do. They turned around again, realizing they had gone too far. The current was dragging them away from the island, and now it was too far to swim back. The sky was still bright, the beach was still visible, but no one on shore could hear them screaming. They paddled against the current, but it was like fighting something bigger than them. Someone panicked. "We need to turn back now." But turn back where? The shore? The island? They were stuck in between. At some point, the horizon blurred, the sun was sinking, and no one had come looking for them. They were out in the open sea, alone. They took turns clinging to the inflatable, paddling when they could. Some cried, but mostly they prayed. Hail Mary, full of grace. One of them kept whispering it over and over again. My sister followed. The others joined in. If God was listening, this was the time to prove it. Their arms ached, their legs were useless, their breath shallow. My sister said one of her friends flinched and started complaining about a big fish bumping him. No one wanted to say anything about sharks and whatnot. Getting out of the water was their only priority. But after that, every time they felt a brush against their legs, their stomachs dropped. Paranoia and panic were becoming second nature. They didn't know how long they'd been out there. The island wasn't closer. The shore was barely visible. The sun dipped lower, and one by one their arms gave out. Legs cramped and locked up. Someone started crying. They were giving up as they had stopped trying to swim. They were just floating, waiting for a miracle. It was past sunset when they saw it. A tiny wooden fishing boat cutting through the waves. They screamed, waved their arms. The boat came closer, but the boat was too small to carry any of them, so the boat could only tow them back to shore. By the time they reached the beach, it was completely dark. They collapsed onto the sand, shivering, their bodies aching, their arms useless from exhaustion. The fishermen looked at them for a long time, before one of them finally said, "You're lucky. 2 months ago, 3 people tried the same thing. We never found them." No one responded, because there was nothing to say. There's a special kind of fear that doesn't hit you until after the danger is past. The kind that creeps up on you at the dinner table when someone looks at you and says, "You went through where?" That's when your hands go cold. That's when you realize just how close you were to making the kind of mistake that people don't walk away from. This is that kind of story. I was driving to Nueva Ecija for a good friend's birthday. He was from San Jose City, and I had never been there before, but Google Maps had just started getting big, and I trusted it to get me where I needed to go. That was my first mistake. Back then, mobile data was unreliable at best, especially in the provinces. I had a signal for most of the drive, but started cutting in and out the farther I was from the capital city. It wasn't a big deal at first. The roads were long and straight, the kind of drive where you could zone out and let the music carry you. I had Hootie and the Blowfish playing on repeat in the background, windows down, cruising at a steady pace. I wasn't worried. I had spoken to my friend earlier, and I remembered one clear direction from our call. Take the second exit when you get to the big roundabout. So when I got there, I did. That was my second mistake. At first, everything seemed fine. The road was wide and paved, surrounded by endless rice fields, a couple of houses here and there, a few tricycles, a car or two. But then the road started to narrow. Paved turned into uneven asphalt, then gravel, then dirt. The tall grass closed in, brushing against the sides of my pickup truck. The only signs of life were the occasional stray dog darting across the road and small scattered houses, except none of them looked lived in. I passed one group of abandoned homes, then another and another. The dirt road stretched on endlessly and empty. I should have turned around. I should have known something wasn't right. I kept going, hoping the road would eventually lead me back to civilization. The road might have been narrow and isolated, but I had seen the concrete arc before I entered. Taluk Tug National Road. The word national made it sound official, maintained, safe. I needed to believe it. It kept me sane. Then I saw 2 men on a small motorcycle, wearing fatigue uniforms, carrying long rifles. They rode past me without a glance, disappearing down the dirt path ahead. I felt relieved. If the army was using this road, then surely it was safe. Just another rural back road where soldiers passed through on patrol. Seeing them was enough assurance that this was a normal military road. Just out of curiosity, I turned off my headlights for a second. Pitch black. Not dim, not shadowy. Just complete and total darkness. No streetlights. No houses with their porch lights on. No glow of a nearby town in the distance. Just my truck, the dirt road, and the void beyond it. I flicked the lights back on, my grip on the wheel a little tighter. For the first time, A small part of me wondered where the hell I really was. But I kept going. I saw a third group of abandoned houses, and there were two men sitting on plastic chairs by the side of the road, a bottle of gin between them. I stopped the truck, stepped out, and stretched my legs. I wasn't scared yet. If anything, I was relieved to see people. They looked at me like I had just crawled out of the jungle. "Why are you here?" one of them asked. I explained that I was on my way to San Jose City and that this is the road Google Maps told me to take. They exchanged a look. Surprised, amused, a little confused. "You actually used this road?" That was when it started to sink in. Something was definitely wrong. One of them pointed down the road. "Keep going, you're about 45 minutes away." The other leaned forward, rested his arms on his knees. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Drive at 100, and don't stop for anything. If anyone blocks you, run them over." I got back in the truck. The road ahead stretched dark and uneven, the tall grass swaying in the wind. I didn't question the warning, I floored it. The truck bounced over ruts and loose dirt, the wheels kicking up dust. I kept my high beams on, eyes locked on the road, hands tight on the wheel. I eventually made it to my friend's house. His family was already sitting down for dinner. I told them about my little detour, how I got lost, how I ended up somewhere I shouldn't have been. His dad, a retired Army general, was listening closely. Then he asked, "What road did you take?" He went still when I told him. "Are you sure?" He set his fork down and let out a slow breath. Then he said, "That's a known guerrilla route. Even the military doesn't use it. If soldiers take that road, they don't come back." I told him about the men I saw in uniform. He shook his head. That wasn't the army. The table fell quiet. The laughter and conversation from earlier disappeared. I sat there staring at my plate, my stomach turning cold. I had driven straight through a place where people disappear, so I consider myself lucky making videos like this one. Do leave me a like and a sub. My bad, couldn't resist. And now for the third story. I had been invited to a wedding in Krakow, and flights there were ridiculously expensive. Instead of flying directly, I decided to cut costs by booking a flight to Warsaw Modlin Airport instead. The logic seemed solid. Flights to Warsaw were significantly cheaper, and I figured I could just rent a car and drive the rest of the way, save some money. After all, Poland wasn't that big. At the airport, I picked up my rental, a compact Fiat, budget-friendly, and just about the cheapest option available. The moment I got behind the wheel, I realized that Poland drives on the right. I was used to driving on the left-hand side, and everything felt off. My instincts kept sending my hands to the wrong side for the gear shift, and I had to actively remind myself to stay in the correct lane, but I figured I would get used to it. I was on an empty stretch of countryside. I haven't seen another car for miles, just flat fields stretching endlessly in every direction. Occasionally I'd pass small clusters of trees or a rundown house. But for the most part, it was just me, alone, with no speed limit. I lost focus for a split second. The car jerked violently, and before I knew it, my tires were sliding off the road into a ditch. It wasn't a major crash, no broken glass, no injuries. But the front of the Fiat was buried deep enough in loose dirt that the wheels had no traction. I tried reversing, but nothing was happening. Tried to push it free, but one look at the angle told me that wasn't going to happen. To make it worse, I had no cell signal. I climbed onto the hood of my car, looking out at the road in both directions. It was empty on both sides. I waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. The wedding was in less than 4 hours, and I was stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help. Finally, in the distance, I saw headlights approaching. A small car, moving fast. I jumped off the hood and started waving my arms, relief flooding in as the vehicle approached. But it didn't stop. It just sped past, disappearing down the road without even slowing down. I stood there stunned, watching the dust settle in its wake. I was completely alone. Then, just as I was about to give up, I saw brake lights. The car slowed down. Then, it started reversing toward me. The car was an older, beaten-up sedan, silver or gray, though it was hard to tell in the fading light. The driver rolled down his window, a middle-aged man, maybe in his 50s, with a thick mustache and a leather jacket that looked older than the car. "Problem?" he asked in heavily accented English. "Yeah, my car's stuck. No service. Can you call a tow truck?" I asked, hopeful. The man shook his head. "No phone. Next town. I take you." I hesitated. I didn't like the idea of leaving my rental behind, but at this point, what else could I do? "You sure?" I asked again. "Yes, no worry. 10 minutes. He gestured toward the passenger seat, waiting for me to get in. The inside of the car smelled like cigarettes and stale fabric, the kind of scent that clung to old upholstery and years of chain smoking. The man didn't talk much, just stared at the road ahead with a blank expression, his hands gripping the wheel loosely. Every now and then, I caught him glancing at me from the corner of his eye, his face unreadable. We drove for a few minutes before he muttered something in Polish under his breath. Then, without warning, he pulled to the side of the road and let out a frustrated sigh. "Problem?" he said. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. "What do you mean, problem?" He didn't answer. Instead, he popped the hood, stepped out, and walked around to check the engine himself. From inside the car, I watched as he leaned in, poking at something under the hood, nodding to himself like he understood what was wrong. Then, just as quickly, he slammed the hood shut. I frowned. If there really was an issue, why close it? He climbed back into the driver's seat, turned to me, and gestured toward the front of the car. "Look," he said, his tone flat. I hesitated. Something about this felt off. If the engine was broken, wouldn't he want to keep the hood open? But what was I supposed to do? Refuse? I was already in the middle of nowhere, stranded, and he was the only way I was getting out. I exhaled sharply and stepped out, keeping my guard up as I moved toward the front of the car. The hood was still warm as I reached to lift it. The moment my fingers touched the metal, I heard the sudden slam of a car door. The engine roared to life. I looked up just in time to see the car lurch forward. I threw myself to the side, hitting the dirt hard as the car sped past, missing me by inches. My knee scraped against the rough gravel, but I barely felt it over the rush of adrenaline flooding my system. For a moment, everything was silent except for the hum of the idling engine. The reverse lights flickered on. I pushed myself up and ran, not back onto the road, but to the dirt path on the side, where the uneven terrain made it impossible for him to follow. I just kept running, feet pounding against the dry earth, my lungs burning. I could hear his car moving, the wheels spinning on the asphalt, but he didn't follow. He just waited. I kept running. I didn't stop until the headlights finally swung away, and I heard the low growl of the engine fade into the distance. Only then did I slow down, hands on my knees, my pulse hammering in my ears. For a while I just stood there, breathing hard, watching the empty road stretch out in both directions. Only then did I step back onto the road and start walking. The chill of night was creeping in. Eventually, I saw lights in the distance. A small town, just a handful of buildings, a gas station, a convenience store, some houses. I walked into the first shop I found. The clerk behind the counter looked up at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. "English?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Can I use your phone?" I was able to get my car towed and bring me to a hotel. I never made it to my friend's wedding. Now, I always pay for a direct flight. These stories are proof that sometimes the world isn't as safe or predictable as we like to believe. Check out the next video for more true stories, and as always, stay safe, aware, and don't get lost in the dark with no way to turn back.